She walked those golden halls every night, counting doors that were never meant to open. Before we step deeper into this story, tell me where you're listening from, comment your country below, and subscribe now if you're ready to uncover what really happened inside America's most magnificent mansion. The winter of 1922 did not arrive gently in a Cheval, North Carolina. It came with teeth. Snow buried the forest paths, iced the iron gates, and pressed itself against the limestone walls of the Caldwell mansion as if trying to force its way inside. The estate rose from 200 acres of land like a declaration of victory, vast, symmetrical, and mercilessly expensive. 250 rooms, dozens of fireplaces burning without pause, a palace built to defy nature and anyone else who dared to challenge it. Margaret Caldwell watched the storm from a third-floor window, her breath fogging the glass. She was 23 years old, married for 18 months, and had not stepped beyond the estate gates in over a year. The world outside felt distant, unreal, like a story she once heard and no longer believed. She pressed her fingers to the cold pane, welcoming the sting. It reminded her she was still awake. Behind her, footsteps crossed the room. She didn't turn. "Your father-in-law requests your presence at dinner," said Clara, her lady's maid, voice flat with practiced obedience. "The senator and his wife are visiting. Mrs. Caldwell expects you in the emerald dress." Margaret's grip tightened on the sill. The emerald dress was heavy, restrictive, chosen not for her comfort but for what it conveyed: status, control, ownership. In this house, clothing was language, and she was fluent enough to know when she was being reminded of her place. "I'll be ready," she said quietly. When Clara left, Margaret stayed where she was. Below, servants pushed through knee-deep snow toward the service entrance, heads down, shoulders bent against the cold. She counted them without thinking. The mansion employed more than 80 people, most living below ground or in drafty cottages on the edge of the property. She remembered seeing those cottages once before her wedding. She'd assumed then that discomfort was temporary. She knew better now. At precisely 7 o'clock, Margaret descended the grand staircase. The emerald dress weighed on her like armor she had not chosen. The main hall gleamed with marble and gold leaf, a cathedral built not for worship but for display. Painted ancestors, many purchased rather than related, stared down from the walls with expressions of inherited judgment. Harrison waited at the bottom of the stairs, handsome and distant, his smile perfected through years of practice. He offered his arm. She took it because refusing was not an option. "You look beautiful," he said, already turning toward the dining room. Margaret smiled, already retreating inward. Dinner would be long. The guests would be important. The expectations would be precise. Every word she spoke would be weighed. Every silence would be noted. Somewhere between the clink of crystal and the hum of polite conversation, her existence would be evaluated like a ledger entry. As they crossed the threshold into the glowing hall, Margaret felt it again, that unmistakable sensation that the house was watching her, not protecting her, not sheltering her, claiming her. And somewhere deep within those walls, something had already begun to shift, quietly, dangerously, waiting for the moment it could no longer be contained. The dining room was built to seat 40, but only 12 places were set, clustered at one end of the endless table. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished silver and porcelain so fine it seemed too fragile for use. Theodore Caldwell presided at the head, his posture rigid, his gaze sharp despite his age. Constance sat beside him, composed and glittering, her jewelry arranged like quiet warnings. Margaret took her assigned seat and folded her hands in her lap, already preparing to disappear. Conversation moved around her in practice circles: railroads, timber contracts, political favors exchanged behind closed doors. She spoke only when addressed, smiled when expected, laughed when prompted. It was a performance she had perfected quickly after marriage. Silence, she had learned, was the safest form of obedience. Then Dr. Ashford spoke her name. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said gently, his voice slipping between courses like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Your husband mentioned you've been having trouble sleeping." Every gaze turned toward her at once. Margaret felt the heat rise in her face, the sudden awareness of her own body as something exposed. She glanced at Harrison. He was studying his wine. "I sleep well enough," she said carefully. "Enough," Dr. Ashford repeated, tasting the word. "But not peacefully. You've been seen walking the halls at night." Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't realized anyone was watching. "The house is large," she said. "Sometimes movement helps clear the mind." Dr. Ashford nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. "The mind is a delicate instrument," he said, "especially in women. The pressures of expectation, of maintaining one's role, can create imbalances. Melancholia, nervous exhaustion, all quite treatable." The word treatable landed heavily. Margaret understood it instinctively. Rest cures, isolation, locked rooms disguised as care. Her hands tightened beneath the table. I am not ill, she said, more firmly than she intended. Constance smiled smoothly. Of course not, dear. The doctor is merely concerned for your well-being. Concern, Margaret thought, had never felt so much like a warning. The dinner continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Theodore's gaze lingered on her longer than before, calculating. Harrison said nothing at all. By the time the men retired to the smoking room, Margaret's chest felt tight, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Constance intercepted her in the corridor. You embarrassed us, she said quietly, her pleasant expression never wavering. You were chosen because we believed you understood how to behave. I understand perfectly, Margaret replied. I meant to be decorative, silent, grateful. Constance's smile hardened. You're meant to know your place. The slap came without warning, sharp enough to snap Margaret's head aside. When she looked back, Constance was already smoothing her gloves. Dr. Ashford will be staying in the East Wing, she said calmly. He'll be conducting a proper evaluation for your own good. That night, Margaret stood alone at her window once more. The snow had stopped, leaving the grounds eerily still beneath the moonlight. Deep within the mansion, machinery groaned the furnaces that fed on endless coal, the hidden systems that kept luxury alive. She thought of the servants below ground, of the cottages at the forest's edge, of how much effort it took to maintain the illusion of perfection. Tomorrow, Dr. Ashford would begin his work. Tomorrow, she would be measured, labeled, and corrected. But as Margaret stared at her reflection in the darkened glass, she felt something unfamiliar take shape beneath the fear. A quiet resistance, a refusal to vanish without understanding why this house needed her silent in the first place. And somewhere in the endless corridors beyond her door, answers waited whether she was meant to find them or not. The evaluation began the next morning in a room Margaret had never noticed before, a narrow chamber tucked behind what she had assumed was a storage door. The space smelled faintly of antiseptic and coal smoke. A leather chair sat at its center, angled deliberately toward the window, while metal instruments lay arranged on a white cloth with ritual precision. Please sit, Dr. Ashford said. Margaret remained standing. From the window she could see the ground stretching outward, the forest dark and frozen, the mountains veiled in mist. A servant crossed the courtyard below, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. This will be easier if you cooperate, he added. Easier for whom? Margaret asked. He paused, then took the chair himself, opening a leather-bound journal. Tell me about your childhood. She understood then that refusal would only sharpen whatever conclusion he intended to reach, so she answered plainly. A modest upbringing, a father who loved books, a mother lost too early. No hysteria, no melodrama, just facts. And when, Dr. Ashford asked, pen moving steadily, did you realize your husband was not the man you believed him to be? The question struck with uncomfortable accuracy. I've treated families like yours for many years, he continued calmly. Disappointment is common. Adaptation is required. Adaptation, Margaret repeated. Or submission? Function, he corrected. Society depends on order. Families depend on hierarchy. Something cold settled in her chest. When she finally left the room, her steps quickened without conscious thought. She needed air, movement, something solid beneath her feet. She took a narrow staircase meant for servants, the walls bare and undecorated, and descended deeper into the mansion than she ever had before. The basement was another world. Stone walls, exposed pipes, the sharp smell of coal and damp earth. Voices drifted toward her low, hurried, edged with frustration. She pressed herself into the shadows and listened. They can't keep paying us like this, a man said. My children are hungry. Lower your voice, another warned. You want to lose this job? There's nothing else, the first replied bitterly. This place is killing us. A woman spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not the worst of it. You know why Rachel left? Margaret's breath caught. They said she married, the man replied. That's not why, the woman said. Mr. Harrison, silence fell, heavy and sudden. They paid her family, the woman continued. Sent her away, told everyone she was troubled. Margaret felt the world tilt. Footsteps approached, and she retreated instinctively, heart hammering, retreating back into the maze of corridors until she emerged into a brighter hall where marble replaced stone and the illusion of elegance resumed. She barely registered Clara's startled face when the maid found her. Mrs. Caldwell, you shouldn't be down there. I got lost, Margaret said. Clara didn't argue, but her eyes said she didn't believe her. Later in the winter garden, Margaret sat among glass walls and exotic plants that thrived only because unseen labor kept them alive. Constance entertained her friends with practiced charm. Laughter floated easily above teacups. I heard you've been unwell, one woman said sweetly. Margaret smiled thinly. I'm perfectly healthy. Dr. Ashford worked wonders with the Patterson girl, Constance added lightly. After treatment, she became much more manageable. Margaret knew that story. Everyone did. The girl never came home. That night, Alone again in her chamber, Margaret looked past the manicured grounds to the distant servant cottages, their windows dim with meager light. A soft knock sounded at her door. Eliza stood there, linens in hand, eyes wide with urgency. "I need to speak with you," she whispered. "Which window with Riddy? Just speak with you." Margaret stepped aside and closed the door. "You were in the basement," Eliza said. "You heard us." "Yes," Margaret replied, "and I want to know everything." Eliza swallowed, then spoke quickly, fear and resolve tangled together. Long hours, injuries ignored. Wages designed to trap families, not sustain them. Accidents covered up. People who complained vanished. "This house," Eliza said, tears streaking her face, "is built on suffering, every brick." Margaret felt the truth settle into place with terrible clarity. She had married into wealth, yes, but also into something rotten at its core. "And you?" Margaret asked softly. "Why tell me?" "Because you're trapped too," Eliza said. "And because maybe, just maybe, you can see what we can't reach." She paced beneath gilded ceilings that now felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. The mansion was not merely a prison, it was a machine. And for the first time, Margaret began to wonder what would happen if it were forced to reveal what it consumed to keep running. Margaret did not wait for permission the next night. She moved through the mansion after midnight, when the fires burned low and even the most vigilant servants allowed themselves brief rest. The corridors felt different now, not grand, but predatory. Every portrait watched, every carpet muffled sound too well. She walked as if the house itself might whisper her location to those who owned it. Theodore Caldwell's study sat at the end of a west-facing hall, its door always locked, its importance made clear by how carefully everyone avoided it. Margaret had watched servants long enough to know where spare keys were kept. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door and slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The room smelled of leather and ink. Dark wood lined the walls, shelves filled with books chosen for display rather than reading. She lit a single lamp and turned to the desk. What she found there stripped away the last of her doubt: contracts, letters, ledgers. Names repeated again and again beside figures that told their own story: wages suppressed, safety repairs postponed indefinitely, payments made quietly to officials who asked too few questions, accidents categorized as worker negligence, compensation calculated to be cheaper than prevention. Margaret read until her vision blurred. This was not excess born of carelessness, it was precision. Suffering measured, accounted for, optimized. She was so absorbed that she did not hear the door open. Looking for something, she spun around. Harrison stood in the doorway, calm, composed, unsurprised. "I couldn't sleep," Margaret said, her voice barely steady. "I wanted to understand." "Now you do," he replied, stepping inside and closing the door. He gathered the papers she'd spread out, stacking them neatly. "Everything you enjoy comes from this. Comfort has a cost." "Not this cost," Margaret said. "This is cruelty," Harrison laughed softly. "This is America. The strong build, the weak endure. And if I refuse to accept that," he met her gaze, eyes cold. "Then you proved Dr. Ashford right." The words settled like iron bars. "You'd have me committed," Margaret said. "Your own wife." "I'd protect my family," he replied without hesitation. "And right now, you're a liability." He left her standing there, surrounded by proof she could not yet use, the door locking behind him. But something had shifted inside her. Fear was still there, sharp, relentless, but beneath it, resolve hardened into shape. They wanted her silent, invisible, corrected. Instead, she would become dangerous. Over the next days, Margaret played her role flawlessly. She attended evaluations, drank tea with Constance, smiled when spoken to. Dr. Ashford noted her improvement with professional satisfaction. No midnight wandering, no outbursts. Compliance restored. At night, she became someone else. By candlelight, she memorized figures and names from Theodore's ledgers. She listened carefully when servants spoke, gathering fragments into a coherent whole. When Eliza brought her fresh linens, Margaret asked quiet questions. Others were drawn in cautiously, then urgently, stories spilling out once they realized she was truly listening. Burns, crushed hands, children lost because wages never stretched far enough, threats delivered politely, silence enforced efficiently. On the fourth night, Eliza led her across the snow to the laundry building. Inside, warmth and whispered voices greeted them. A dozen servants gathered, wary but resolute. Margaret told them what she'd found, told them she was already marked as unstable, already in danger. "If I do nothing," she said, "I disappear quietly. If I act, I may disappear loudly, but the truth will survive." Silence followed. Then a man with scarred hands stepped forward. "I'll speak," he said. "So will others." Margaret listened until dawn, carrying their words like weight she had chosen willingly. She had days, perhaps a week before Dr. Ashford's final recommendation, days to transform memory into evidence, days to move faster than the machinery designed to erase her. As she returned to the mansion, the sky paling behind the mountains, Margaret understood the risk with perfect clarity. Once the truth left her hands, there would be no safe return, and for the first time, she welcomed that. By the fifth morning, Margaret was running on little more than will. She slept in fragments, her nights divided between writing and listening, committing details to paper in a hand cramped from haste. Names, dates, injuries, payments disguised as generosity, threats framed as concern. She hid the pages inside the lining of a poetry book no one would ever think to open. Each finished sheet felt like stolen breath, precious, fragile, impossible to replace. Dr. Ashford noticed her exhaustion but interpreted it as progress. "You appear calmer," he observed during their session, pen scratching steadily. "More accepting." "I understand my responsibilities better now," Margaret replied, choosing each word with care. "I allowed emotion to cloud my judgment before," he nodded, satisfied. "Insight is encouraging. With continued stability, more intensive measures may be unnecessary." The warning was polite, but unmistakable. That afternoon, Thomas's accident shattered what remained of the illusion. Margaret heard about it before she saw it, whispers in corridors, Clara's voice tight with unease. A furnace malfunction, a scream, blood on stone that servants scrubbed away before the family descended for tea. His arm, it's bad. Margaret went to Constance and Theodore without asking permission. "He needs a proper doctor," Margaret said. "The machinery is unsafe. You know that." Theodore regarded her as one might regard a faulty tool. He failed to exercise caution. He was forced to choose between danger and starvation. The room went cold. "You forget yourself," Theodore said quietly. "No," Margaret replied, her voice shaking but steady. "I remember everyone you forget." Harrison dragged her out before Theodore could respond. "Are you trying to be locked away?" he hissed. "Because this is how you ensure it." That night, Margaret knew time had run out. She volunteered to accompany Harrison into Asheville the next day, cloaking urgency and obedience. A bookstore visit, she suggested. Wholesome reading. Dr. Ashford would approve. Harrison agreed reluctantly, watching her as though she might fracture under scrutiny. The carriage ride felt endless. Snow-covered roads, townspeople hunched against the cold, lives lived in the margins of fortunes like the Caldwells. The moment Harrison left her at the bookstore, Margaret ran. The telegraph office was warm and smelled of ink. Her hands trembled as she wrote the message. Evidence, labor violations, corruption, Caldwell estate, urgent, then the post office, registered mail, priority handling. She watched the clerk stamp the package, the sound echoing like a gavel. Once it entered the system, it could not be reclaimed. Margaret returned to the bookstore, purchased volumes she did not care about, and met Harrison for tea. She smiled. She thanked him. She praised Dr. Ashford's guidance. Harrison relaxed, convinced the threat had passed. That night, Margaret stood at her window again, heart pounding not with fear but anticipation. In 3 days, the truth would reach New York. In 3 days, everything would change. Movement below caught her eye. A figure crossed the courtyard quickly, deliberately, heading toward the west wing, toward Theodore's study. Margaret's blood ran cold. If someone was inside that room now, everything she had done could unravel. Evidence discovered, suspicion sharpened, retaliation immediate and brutal. She didn't hesitate. Pulling on her robe, Margaret slipped into the corridor and followed the shadow, her footsteps silent against the marble. Whatever was happening in that study, she knew one thing with terrifying certainty. If she didn't stop it, she might not survive the night. Margaret reached the study just as the door eased shut. Light flickered beneath it. She pushed inside and froze. A man stood at Theodore's desk, rifling through drawers with frantic precision. Papers lay scattered, the lamp turned low, shadows jumping along the walls. "Stop," Margaret whispered. "You can't be here." The man spun around. The hood fell back. "Robert." "I'm not leaving empty-handed," he said quietly. His burnt fingers trembled around a bundle of documents. "When they come for us, and they will, we need leverage." Before Margaret could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Panic snapped through her like ice. "Hide, now." Robert extinguished the lamp and pressed himself into the darkness behind the desk as Margaret stepped back into the hall just as Clara appeared, breathless. "Mr. Theodore is conducting a security search. Someone reported an intruder." Margaret forced calm into her voice. "I couldn't sleep." "You need to return to your room, immediately." Margaret obeyed, every step away from the study feeling like betrayal. Once inside her chamber, she locked the door and listened. Voices rose below Theodore's sharp commands, servants answering, boots crossing marble, minutes stretched into hours. At dawn, Clara returned with breakfast. "They didn't find him," she whispered, "but papers are missing." Margaret's stomach twisted. Theodore would not let this go. He would interrogate, threaten, break people until someone confessed. That evening, the household was summoned to the main hall. Margaret ran. Robert stood surrounded by men, defiant despite the odds. "I took your documents," he said, "and if you touch any of us, they go public." It was a bluff. But Theodore didn't know that. All of it, to New York. The silence that followed was absolute. "You've destroyed yourself," Theodore said softly. "Maybe," Margaret replied, "but you're no longer untouchable." By morning, Dr. Ashford declared her unstable. Commitment was arranged. Her credibility dismantled with professional ease. Then, at mid-afternoon, carriages arrived. Federal investigators. A journalist from New York, Jacob Reese, met her gaze across the hall and smiled grimly. And it arrived at exactly the right moment. The mansion erupted into chaos. Documents seized, servants stepped forward. Theodore's authority collapsed in real time. That night, Margaret left the estate under protection. She did not look back. Behind her stood a palace built on silence. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and a freedom she had paid for dearly. For the first time, the story was no longer theirs to control. The Caldwell mansion did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It unraveled. Investigators occupied Theodore's study for days, cataloging ledgers he had once treated as untouchable. Boxes of documents were carried out past marble columns that no longer impressed anyone. Servants who had lived in fear found their voices when federal authorities stood between them and retaliation. Stories poured out consistent, documented, impossible to dismiss. The newspapers did the rest. By week's end, the Caldwell name had become synonymous not with refinement but with exploitation. Headlines spread from New York to San Francisco. Editorials questioned how many other fortunes were built the same way. Reformers seized the moment. Lawyers circled. Politicians distanced themselves with sudden enthusiasm. Dr. Ashford vanished from the narrative almost immediately, his diagnosis rendered meaningless by corroborated evidence and sworn testimony. His authority dissolved as quickly as it had once condemned. Margaret never returned to the mansion. She was moved quietly between safe houses, assisted by people who believed the truth mattered more than pedigree. Her name appeared in print only once carefully, cautiously, but the story did not need her presence to survive. It stood on its own, bolstered by facts too heavy to bury. From a small rented room in another city, Margaret read about the trials, the settlements, the reforms promised and debated. She understood that justice would be imperfect, that wealth rarely surrendered without preserving itself in new forms. Some of the Caldwell's power would endure, but not all of it. The servants received compensation. Safety inspectors arrived. Other estates, suddenly nervous, made changes before anyone could look too closely. It was not enough. It was something. On a cold morning not unlike the one she had left behind, Margaret walked alone through unfamiliar streets, her breath visible in the air. No guards, no watchers, no doors she was forbidden to open. Her future was uncertain, unprotected, unremarkable. It was hers. Behind her, an age built on silence began slowly, reluctantly, to answer for itself. And though the American dream remained deeply flawed, one truth had slipped beyond anyone's control. Once spoken, it could not be locked away again. Should I write the next part?